Controversial opinion. I love Pokemon. Actually, let me change into my controversial hat. Right, now we can conduct some business. I love Pokemon Sword and Shield. And to be honest, I thought you lot felt the same way because the only 2 Sword and Shield videos that I've ever posted did really well. But the truth is, Sword and Shield might be the most polarizing Pokemon games we've ever seen. It turns out Galar is the Marmite of the Pokemon franchise. Because collectively and in perfect unison, half of us are raving about these games while the other half seem to be fuming, seething with rage, offended by the very prospect of revisiting Galar. But have you ever thought about why? I read through all the comments on my Sword and Shield videos, and beyond that, I even put up a community tab post asking for your realist opinions on Galar and the games as a whole. And right, over 250 people replied to that post, so I read through the entirety of them. Hilariously though, in reading all the comments and trying to look at Galar through an objective lens, I think I've exacted the reason that people can't make a collective decision on these games. And it's absolutely crazy. The conclusion that I've drawn is that for the most part, every reason to love these games doubles as a reason to hate them. That's a ludicrous statement, I'm aware, but listen, I will prove my point. I'm gonna go over the points that people love and the points that people hate, and you'll literally see that most of them are different sides of the same coins. And before you comment it, because I know you freaking web gremlin, behave, this is entirely subject to opinion. It's just that some of your opinions are wrong and bad. But just so that we're all on the same even playing field, I'll present my points and run this as a pros and cons list so you can see where I stand. But the sake of this is to open a conversation with you, a forum for debate. I'm gonna go over Galar under a microscope, the good, the bad, and the ugly. God, that's ugly. So is Pokemon Sword and Shield the GOAT, or are they really as bad as people make them out to be? Let's talk about it. Right, so let's open with Galar as a place, the region itself. Inspired by the UK, Galar weaves in British culture, giving us character designs and environments that feel uniquely homey. From the rolling and free-breathing countryside to the industrial workhorse of Motostoke, the overarching Edinburgh-esque castle, and interesting architecture all around this place. Every route and city in Galar aesthetically breathes new life and vibrance into the Pokemon world. That is not up for debate. Brother, this place has some of the most magical locations in Pokemon history. Glimwood Tangle, I rest my case. However, when you look deeper, you'll notice that the routes are genuinely tiny. As in, Pokemon Sword and Shield literally have the most expansive free-roaming area that has ever been introduced to the Pokemon games up till this point. And trust me, we'll get to the wild area, but for now, my point stands that sure, the routes are beautiful, but they weren't at all challenging, or long, or honestly memorable. I felt going from one big checkpoint to the next was easy, passive, boring. Beyond that, right, aesthetically, like, Spikemuth is an awesome place. A scrappy, punk-driven hub that pays pretty solid homage to the UK's rich grunge scene. And on that, you can really see that Pokemon went out their way to emphasize the range of this region and this country. It's refreshing to see the series move beyond straight-up grass, generic forests and caves. Aesthetically. But again, so easy to navigate. Hell, Spikemuth is literally a hallway simulator. One thing this region undeniably did well though was the gym challenge in the way that it was presented. Pokemon went full Premier League, huge stadiums, roaring crowds, and also the soundtrack, brother! Come on, not one of you Swish haters can tell me the soundtrack doesn't absolutely smash it out the park. Might genuinely be the best music of any Pokemon game ever. These games did that part correctly. Chef's kiss. I'm saying that with my entire chest. I won't dig too deep, but if you want proof, just type in Pokemon Sword and Shield soundtrack on YouTube and listen for yourself. Or better yet, replay the games, but with a conscious effort to listen to the game as well as playing it. They did good. That's a pro, and if you disagree, you're wrong and you don't deserve a birthday. I might be a bit harsh. But look, the roster of gym leaders that Galar has is surreal. Milo, the rugby player, Nessa, the gymnast, Bea, the future ex-wife. What? Even this nose with an old lady attached to it felt distinctly British in essence. Some stereotypes are there for a reason, bro. If you were born and raised in the UK and you've got a grandma, this is what she looks like, bar exactly none. However, my point is, each one of these gym leaders ooze with personality, flair, style, dynamism, and their own unique flavor. Beyond that, this is the first game we got different gym leaders depending on which game we chose to play, and they actually all had personality. Bea and Gordy were exclusive to Pokemon Sword, and Alistair and Melanie exclusive to Shield. We can talk about the mechanics of the gyms, etc. a little bit later, but for now we're focusing mainly on the aesthetic and the immersion factor. And on the immersion factor, one thing that really sucked me in was that the adults see and understand the genuinely problematic environmental, societal, or big scary Pokemon issues, and instead of straight up pawning that off on a child, the adults of Galar take responsibility and tell us, the player, yes, there's a problem, yes, it's serious, but you're a kid, so go be a kid and leave it to the big dogs. Which just makes the immersion factor so much more realistic. It makes the protagonist role more exciting because it doesn't feel like everyone expects you to save the day. And so when you do it, there's a bit of a vigilante aspect, I guess, which Pokemon hasn't done before. Usually it's just, hey, this kid knows how to throw down, let's put all our eggs in this basket and yeet him at a kaiju. Also, although yes, Team Yell are pretty true to the UK punk culture mixed with the football hooligan vibes, they are absolutely ludicrous and annoying. And listen, this is just an assumption, but judging just by the visual, they look like they smell bad. Bro, tell me this guy doesn't smell like sweat and socks and quavers. It's not really the point, to be honest. The point is that a lot of people hate their cult-like culture that for some reason revolves exclusively around Piers and Marnie. But beyond that, they don't offer any challenge at literally any point throughout the game, and every time we see them is just consistently annoying and pointless. It's Team Skull, but worse in every conceivable way. So listen, with all the aforementioned thoughts and the individualism in the characters themselves, and I know I was speaking negatively, but by the way, speaking of the characters themselves, can we talk about the overarching generational torch passing that's symbolized literally all over the place? Like, the characters aren't just cool, but they actually feel like they progress. Bede and Marnie progress to become the gym leaders in their own right, Bede taking over from his sugar granny and Marnie becoming the successor to her older brother Piers' gym. And then like Sonia taking the reins from Magnolia in the literal passing down of lab coats. And after Rose loses his crap and tries to Thanos everyone, Leon takes the reins in the chairman role. It's a running theme that feels awesome because it creates such a feeling of progression outside of just the player and the rival, which is what we normally get. It feels like everyone is individually moving forward with their respective dreams and achieving things in their own right around us, which again just adds to the dynamism of this place. I will say the absence of voice acting is obvious here more than ever. I can't deny that. I'll sing the praise of the gym leaders over everyone, but watching these scenes play out with silent facial expressions did make them feel somewhat hollow at times. We literally got a gym leader who sings through captions. Like, bro, at least do what you did with Roxy and Unova. Do the whole P-O-K-E Pokemon! Like that thing, at least do that, do you know what I mean? It gives it something. So in terms of the character design and personality, the region's individual yet distinctly Britain-coated designs and layouts, the vibrance and the scenery, I am gonna put the Galar region itself in the pros list. I know that there's a lot of cons, bro. The routes suck layout-wise and difficulty-wise. I'm not arguing that fact, but you have to admit the place visually, aesthetically, and vibe-wise has a lot going for it. So do the characters. I like them. Listen, cool. Now I'm gonna take on an interesting controversy. The wild area. This place was... Yep. Okay, so there's a few sub-points that we're gonna need to cover, and it's quite extensive, so I'm gonna go over some of them like later in the video. But anyway, as we do that, remember that Scarvi and PLA didn't exist at this point. That's one very important fact. This was the first glimpse at the open world concept that we ever got, and in saying that, I'm gonna call it a necessary step. I just think the Pokemon Company were overly optimistic. They bit off a little more than they could chew, and then they kept biting. Prime example, raids. We were never given them before. Now, I'm aware they sucked in Galar. I'm not dumb. They were janky, long, the NPCs were brain dead. Not to mention the bugs, not the kind you'd find in early game forests of Pokemon. No, actual glitches like raid den exploits that literally let people farm shinies without breaking a conceivable sweat, completely trivializing the hunting process and arguably ruining shiny hunting for a lot of people, myself included. The level scaling specifically, let's talk about that. That seems like a massive point of controversy. I loved it. I could go to a new area by my own accord and find Pokemon that I wouldn't dare fight or try and catch yet, but they were something for me to work towards. Beyond that, when we're introduced to the wild area, it's presented as this super expansive, ever-changing area that's ours to explore. And then when you go to explore it, it's mostly just empty. There's just random Pokemon sort of dotted around in grass patches here and there, and sure, there's a static mon or two, but it's just sparse. However, in saying that, without the idea of the raid dens that they so drastically overlooked, we would never have seen Terra raids in Scarvi, or even back yet, Dynamax Adventures, and we all love those. Dynamax Adventures are sick. They are. You can't argue that. The weather's also controversial for whatever reason. People actually claim that this is dumb. I don't think so. I think this is awesome. Not only does it perfectly emulate the fact that the UK's weather is entirely and unfathomably unpredictable, but it creates an immersion factor that certain Pokemon prefer certain weather conditions to reveal themselves. And I like that. I don't know, man. Listen, I like Pokemon. I'm just gonna see it through rose-tinted goggles. So with all that being said, I love all that the wild area led to. Without it, we wouldn't be where we are in the franchise's progression, but I can't deny that it feels incomplete. I can't say it's a pro because of what it brought us in the future, because we're here to analyze it for what it is. It was an incredible concept done wrong, so I'm gonna put it in the cons section. I would say the concept of the wild area phenomenal, the execution sucked. We're in agreement there, right? Remember, you guys can voice your opinions. I'm here to chat. This is a forum for debate. So next up, I want to talk about the story. I don't even think this wasn't as controversial. I don't think you can argue with the fact that the Darkest Day was a thing that we all did, but I don't know if you guys enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it. It felt kind of wedged in there. It felt rushed. It felt incomplete. Rose was so adamant to do something so drastic and immediate to tackle a problem that won't be prevalent for another insert big number here amount of years. And then when his plan starts to unfold and Pokemon start G-maxing and Dynamaxing out of nowhere in the wild, we don't even get to go and see it as the protagonist, never mind stop it. Which brings me to Leon, right? Leon, really strangely, is actually another massive point of contention. Now, sure, my guy decides to rock up wearing tights, sports shorts, a cape, a snapback, bright purple hair, a chin strap, and one singular thumbless glove, but that's not even the controversy here, although it should be. A lot of people actually argue that Leon takes some of the fun away when he insists that he's the one that should be going to check out and quell the region's Dynamax mishaps and chaos. But that's sort of his responsibility as a champion. No? He has the proclaimed title that rubber stamps him as the best and most experienced Pokemon trainer in the region. He shows up when things go down. He has his Charizard shield us from danger when Eternatus shows up. And listen, as much as his fashion sense could really pick a lane, he's probably the most champion-esque champion we've ever had. The truest to the enemy. They make it easy to revere the guy is all I'm trying to say. Beyond that, and I'm not defending the evil plot, is the dumbest thing ever, but beyond that, the story progression feels like a bigger deal the deeper you get. Granted, I mainly mean that in the Pokemon challenge. Like, people go from not knowing who you are at all, because why would they, to learning your name, to eventually chanting it. And listen, not only do the gym leaders have such individual and cool demeanors and personalities, but they all act how they're supposed to act. Except kind of Piers, but he does just in his own sort of unconventional fight the machine kind of way, which I'm all about. The gym leaders command respect is what I'm trying to overarchingly say here in a weird way. Beyond that, they're seen as authoritarians. They have staff evacuate the areas before facing all the Dynamaxed mons in the post-game, and they all act in a very protective way when it comes to their towns and cities respectively. They're seen as like guardians of their domain. And I like that. I like that a lot. In saying that though, Galar's story was ridiculously linear, even for a Pokemon game. It was completely predictable, and the lack of a substantial or meaningful post-game left us grass avoiders craving more. Sure, we eventually got some great post-game content, but it was behind a paywall in the DLCs that didn't come till months down the road. And a lot of it felt just like it should have been post-game content. So with all that said, I'm putting the story in the cons section. It was bland, lackluster, straightforward, and didn't do the character creation or designs justice. We'll segue to the DLCs later, but for now I want to touch on Galar's mechanics. Pokemon Sword and Shield brought arguably some of the most significant changes to the Pokemon franchise in generations. On the surface, the quality of life improvements seem pretty simple. Auto-saving so you don't lose hours of progress, nature mints that let you chop and choose your Pokemon's nature without a bunch of needless hanky-panky with a ditto, free move reminders in every Pokemon Center, and the ability to access your box from literally anywhere in the game. No more rummaging through menus for a HM meal just to cross a literal 3-block wide river. Now, although a lot of these changes were good changes, they were long overdue changes. Modernizing a franchise that, and I hate to say it, often felt stuck in the 90s. Going back to the wild area, of course, we've got the high-level Pokemon encounters, the rotating spawn tables, and the weather systems that keep things fresh. Pokemon Breath of the Wild area. But we cannot touch on Galar's mechanics without tackling Dynamax and Gigantamax. Firstly, Dynamax. Imagine Pokemon, but big. Yup, that's this. If that's what you're after, then hey, this is that. You press a button, and for 3 turns, your Pokemon has double the HP and access to some crazy overpowered moves with a mad second-hand buff and 100% accuracy. And hey, look, they're big now. So firstly, let's touch on why they chose to invent and implement Dynamax in the first place. The concept was actually rooted in some of the oldest inspirations for Pokemon as a whole, being kaiju battles. Pokemon's original creator, Satoshi Tajiri, spent his childhood watching countless reruns of Ultraman, some series where giant monsters would brawl it out in city-sized arenas. Occasionally, Ultraman would literally release kaiju that he had previously captured in capsules to fight his battles for him. Sound familiar? In many ways, Dynamax is Pokemon's way of returning to its kaiju roots, and many fans actually found the spectacle fun. Beyond that, some of the Gigantamax forms introduced, like Gengar or Charizard for instance, had genuinely creative and outright cool designs. That's not up for debate either. Literally some of the most expensive modern Pokemon cards are those exact Pokemon in their Gigantamax forms. However, as beloved as these new features could be, it also fueled some crazy backlash in the Pokemon community. For many, the game's new mechanic felt somewhat shallow, less classic kaiju epic and more gimmicky anime cameo. And listen, it doesn't help that the last time they decided to alter Pokemon in an evolutionary way, we got Megas. I'm not necessarily saying that Dynamax is a negative, I'm just saying when we compare the creativity between Dynamaxing and Mega Evolution, you already had some big shoes to fill. Do you know what I mean? It just felt like a bit of a step backwards. It feels like gimmick-wise with Mega Evolutions, they peaked too early. Hell, they even know that. All they had to do to keep us talking for literally an entire year was to show the Mega symbol at the end of a Legends trailer. That's it. Megas are far and away the best gimmick we've ever had because it transformed Pokemon meaningfully, soulfully. It bred new life and personality into Pokemon we already knew and loved for the most part. Pokemon like Gengar or Kangaskhan had an entirely new purpose on the field and we were given some of the coolest designs ever. Brother, they even full 180'd Gengar Shiny from being literally one of the worst of all time to its Mega being one of the best of all time. And how did they follow that up? Well, with Z-moves, obviously, but we don't talk about those. In an evolutionary case, it was with the half-baked millennial memes like Long Cat Meowth and Chonkachu, which, like, fair enough, bro, but come on. Beyond that, the saving grace of the whole energy overload phenomenon was Gigantamaxing, but hey, how do we unlock that again? Oh, that's right. Once you've beaten the game in its entirety, paid to play a DLC, fed a capable Pokemon some very specific soup, and trained for like a decade. Sick. We could talk on this for hours, by the way. They wanted to hit us with a game that blew our expectations out the water from all angles, but like the YCOM system, which was meant to streamline trading and co-op opportunities, ended up being about as reliable as a Metapod against Blaine. Connecting with friends felt insanely clunky, and it was a huge missed opportunity to build more of a social experience within the confines of the games. I guess on the upside we got Pokemon camps. People love Pokemon, and catching them just to battle doesn't always create the biggest one-to-one connection with your Pokemon. And the way of answering that lies in the camps and how you can interact with Pokemon in a way that you never could before. Not only that, you could set up a camp alongside someone else, be it an NPC or a friend, if you have any, and watch your Pokemon interact with theirs and each other and you. It's adorable. People, myself included, really enjoyed that. Also, the character customization was taken to some really cool places. The amount of variety and again, individualism that you could create was seemingly endless. People love that as well. It's always cool to feel like your character is distinctly your character. But as a whole, it feels pretty clear that the mechanics of Sword and Shield were one of the main drawbacks of the games. Don't get me wrong, autosave, nature mints, and simplified team building were cool and new and fresh and great and synonyms. I bet competitive Pokemon players were in heaven. But when you weigh up all the new mechanics and look at their execution, you start seeing the cracks, but like bigger than cracks. Play the Fisher animation. That. Dynamax's background lore is cool in theory, but it didn't feel like that in the implementation. There's just like no lasting depth. Sure, you can rebuttal with the fact that Gigantamaxes are different, and don't get me wrong, I love some of them. Gmax Machamp was awesome. Same with a lot of them, but again, we couldn't even access that mechanic until we've already completed the damn game. And yes, the wild area teased the open world Pokemon dream, but it was marred by performance issues, repetitive, somewhat empty layouts, and trees. We'll get onto the tree later, don't worry. Ultimately, quality of life improvements are an expectation by this point in the series, not a revolutionary achievement. Call me an optimist or a cynic, but I believe that it shouldn't be too difficult a task when you're literally the highest grossing media franchise of all time. So when all these cool new mechanics turn out to be a mixed bag of hype and disappointment, it's hard to not lump them in the missed potential box. I'm putting it on the con list. I feel like I'm being a pessimist. I need something to put on the pros list. Hold on. Ball Guy. Obvious objective win. Nobody dislikes Ball Guy. Ball Guy made the game. Bring back Ball Guy Pro. Okay, next. Moving swiftly on, Sword and Shield gave us one of the most memorable new rosters in recent Pokemon history. Pokemon like Rillaboom, Grimmsnarl, and Hatterene weren't just great designs, but they brought unique typings and strategies that shook up the competitive meta. Even to this day, even Wolf, who I consider the best competitive Pokemon YouTuber, brought a Galar starter to his World Championship team. So yes, a silly, tall, handsome, hilarious, buff, humble Scottish man with absolutely no competitive experience, I'm about to talk about it, with the help of my pal Dodd. He plays a lot of competitive Pokemon, so if anything in this segment is complete bogus, you all have my permission to throw tomatoes at him. So the newly introduced Pokemon of Galar. Rillaboom's access to Grassy Glide turned it into a staple of many competitive teams, while Grimmsnarl's prankster ability and status moves, most notably both screens, makes for a super dangerous utility Pokemon. And Hatterene very quickly became a trick room powerhouse, delivering devastating hits while shrugging off status effects with Magic Bounce. Then there's Zacian, the crown jewel of Galar's legendary lineup. With its Fairy Steel typing, blistering speed, and the absurd damage boost from its ability, Intrepid Sword, Zacian became one of the most dominant Pokemon in competitive play. It wasn't just strong, it was borderline oppressive, carving out a space on almost every serious team in Gen 8. And yet, for all its highlights, Galar's roster missed some of the obvious opportunities. While Pokemon like Yamper and Poltegeist leaned into British culture, the designs didn't didn't go far enough for me. Where was the Pokemon inspired by Robin Hood or a proper Loch Ness monster? The rumours that went around before the game's release about potential designs almost spoiled the end results in a way. And interestingly, we can't talk about the Pokemon in the game without talking about the Pokemon that weren't. Dexit. That's what everyone called it. The dramatic slice to the roster of Pokemon that would be available in the new titles. So, if you weren't there, essentially, with the hype period of the game, Pokemon revealed that we wouldn't be able to transfer any Pokemon to Sword and Shield that weren't already catchable in the games. But that isn't even the bad part. Well, I guess the worst part. The worst part was that Masura made an announcement, and in that, his reasoning for why they were so dramatically Thanosing the Dex was so that Game Freak could instead focus their resources on making the graphics for all of the present Pokemon and for the rest of the game top tier, which would have been incredibly valid if it wasn't complete bogus. Everyone deep in the Pokemon community knows about the photo of this very specific tree. This thing looks like it was rendered in Windows XP. This incredibly sad looking sycamore became the prime example of how little Game Freak put into the design world. Then, right, there was the whole Wingull fiasco. If you've ever seen a Wingull float around in Sword and Shield, it's lifeless, it's pathetic, it's hovering. And a Pokemon fan, a literal university student, went off and made a better Wingull animation from complete scratch in under 24 hours, effectively proving that the extra resources dedicated to the existing Pokemon argument is just not true, to put it politely. So now listen, I know I went down a rabbit hole there with the whole Dexit thing, ha 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 comedy, but let's get back on track and talk about the new Pokemon. There were more than a few madly Americanized cliches thrown into the mix, like Mr. Rhyme or Galarian Wheezing, very Teehee Cheerio Spot of Tea type designs. Listen, I understand that the rest of the world may see us over here in the UK and assume everyone here wears top hats while tap dancing in the snow, but doesn't that feel a little bit on the nose? Believe it or not, we're not all Winston Churchill. At least they gave us a James Bond lizard. So, were the Gen 8 Pokemon a pro or a con to this game? Look, the sheer creativity behind some of these designs, like Toxtricity's punk rocker aesthetic, or Obstagoon's rebellious vibe, and by the way, his shiny, are amazing. Beyond that, the G-Maxes all have cool and unique designs, except for the wedding cake. I don't know what the hell that was, or why they went with it, but for me, they're literally all negated by Galarian Mr. Rhyme. Brother, I hate this thing. I genuinely believe this could be the worst Pokemon. There's 1,000 of these guys. One invariably has to be the worst. I vote for that one. Look at him. Blech. But listen, the fact that even in 2025 you'll still see a long list of competitively viable teams hold 2 or 3 Galarian Pokemon as staples mean that no matter what I say or what I feel, the roster is still a clear pro. I'm trying to be as objective as I can here. I want to actually now put shiny hunting into its own category. We've earned that right, I think. For us who actively chase shiny Pokemon, Galar was such an interesting one. In Sword and Shield, it's a serious mixed bag. Again, mainly because of the overworld. Sure, this game introduced the overworld Pokemon and the wild area, but one thing that really annoyed me as an avid shiny hunter was that disconnect from the overworld mons not revealing if they're shiny until you're actively in battle. So you still need to individually encounter Pokemon to see if they have a color deformity. It feels like another blatant missed opportunity, and it removes any immersion factor because the Pokemon that you see in the overworld in fact are not the Pokemon that you see when you encounter them. One is shiny, the other isn't. However, to counteract that point, Dynamax Adventures. I rest my case. Although no I don't, let's talk about it. Dynamax Adventures were the coolest version of a raid den, essentially. The Pokemon rental system they created was a cool new way to strategize. The payoff was huge with legendary potential, and especially within the shiny hunting aspect, we were given a fresh new way to shiny hunt legendary Pokemon from our childhoods. I've personally sunk hundreds of hours into DAs, and you know what? Time well wasted. I have had a grand time, and I expect to stop no time soon. Sure, shiny hunting is both a pro and a con depending on how you're hunting in Sword and Shield, but Dynamax Adventures do it for me. It's the thing that I go back to do most in these titles, even to this day. So I'm calling shiny hunting a pro, even after the janky bugs and exploits and lack of overworld shinies. So we can't even access DAs without first purchasing the Crown Tundra DLC. And so I'm going to use that as a segue. Game Freak took a whole new approach with Sword and Shield, and instead of giving us a deeper storyline and an extensive post-game or giving us the traditional third version of the games, we were given extra paid content, which on paper was a great idea. The Isle of Armor focused on training and exploration first and foremost, introducing the new legendary bear Urshifu, while the Crown Tundra focused on hunting legendary Pokemon. Galar's own twist on Pokemon that we already knew and love, and might I just add, they freaking nailed the Galarian bird designs. All three of them are just incredible. I don't care, bro, I'm a huge fan. Aside from that though, we were given new areas to explore, new Pokemon to catch, and new mechanics like Dynamax Adventures. For many, this was hugely welcomed, myself included, bro. The DLC expanded the world of Galar, brought back fan favorite Pokemon from previous gens, and offered some of the most challenging content in the game. We can also talk about the fact that the signature legendaries of the DLCs, Urshifu and Calyrex, added something really cool to competitive play. Urshifu became controversial pretty instantly. Its Unseen Fist ability ignores the move Protect entirely, giving it a huge competitive edge over other Pokemon, and to top it off, its signature moves, Surging Strikes or Wicked Blow, depending on whether you have Water or Dark Shifu, always critical hits. With access to these crazy moves and the ability to bypass the game's most common defensive strategy, Urshifu felt blatantly and unequivocally overpowered. Then came Calyrex, the Onion Head, whose Shadow Rider and Ice Rider forms dominated the VGC space. Calyrex's raw power and speed combined with moves like Astral Barrage made it almost impossible to counter without building entire teams around it. Not only does Calyrex, insert horse here Rider, have two abilities, but the ability Grim and or Chilling Neigh works like a Moxie Pokemon, and it raised Rex's main attack stat by 1 stage after each knockout, allowing them to quickly snowball entire teams in just a few turns. Funny thing is that even now, a number of years later, both of the DLC legendaries are still some of the top picks in the current VGC meta, with Calyrex Ice Rider at 26% usage and Shadow sitting around 19%. These Pokemon felt like they were designed for the competitive format, but only if the comp player was willing to pay for the DLC, which of course immediately created noise and sparked accusations of them being the first pay-to-win Pokemon to ever be introduced. If we're being completely fair too, it's a pretty valid thought train. Core competitive Pokemon were locked behind a paywall for the first time ever. To this day, they still haven't beaten the pay-to-win allegations. The DLCs also expanded the life of the game exponentially. Instead of playing Sword and Shield for a year, they kept it alive for nearly 3 with updates, raid events, online competitions, and of course the DLC expansions themselves. For many, this meant that they rinsed more hours into Swish than any previous Pokemon game. Some would call that a success. I mean, they certainly kept a bigger player base for a much longer time, and as a company, that's probably a pretty big W. But it did feel like they milked Sword and Shield dry, but I get that though. Overall, the DLC brought us new content, but it left many fans feeling like a lot of it should have been part of the base game all along. Features like Pokemon walking alongside you and the open world-esque zones really highlighted just how much of the base game felt rushed and somewhat incomplete. Which brings us to the real issue that most people had. The DLC wasn't just about adding new content, it felt like an attempt to smooth over pre-release controversies. Remember the whole Diggs thing that I talked about before? Yeah, it was bad, man. Only 400 Pokemon were to be included out of the 890 Pokemon that existed at the time. The controversies pre-release set the stage for the DLC to act as damage control of sorts. By adding new Pokemon and fleshing out the wild area, the expansions felt a bit less like an exciting bonus to the wonders that were already there, and instead like a belated apology. However, in saying that, they introduced a lot of good with the bad. I'm just saying it felt like a lot of it was putting out fires, as opposed to giving us a lot of new cool shiny stuff. I will say though, with Chest, the Galarian birds are sick. Moltres looks so good with the new colorway, same with Zapdos and the ostrich vibes, bro. Not only that, but their shinies revert them to their original Kanto colors, and that's such a sweet homage to their origin. The DLCs did do a lot right, and for that, I'm gonna be more optimistic and put them in the pros section. And to be honest, it seems like that's all I've got to talk about. So let's weigh it up. In the pros section, we have Bogai, first and foremost, my unspoken king. We have the Galar region itself with its stunning locales, memorable characters, and undeniable charm. The Pokemon roster, which is packed with creative designs and competitive standouts like Rillaboom, Zacian, Toxtricity, the legendary Onion Head, etc. The DLCs, man, they were fun. They did what they were supposed to do. Sure, it felt a lot like an overdue thing, but in a beggars can't be choosers situation, they did pretty good there. And Galarian Zapdos has my heart. And that brings us to the cons list. Galarian Mr. Mime, because yucky. The new mechanics like Dynamax, which often felt shallow or gimmicky compared to past innovations, and the quality of life improvements feeling more like a necessary game of catch up over a new cool thing. It's weird, man. I started out this video sure about why I loved Pokemon Sword and Shield, but now I honestly have no idea what to think. The things I choose to love about this game literally all have insane downsides or controversial points surrounding them. Love Gigantamax? Can't access it until you've already beaten the game. Sick. Big fan of the competitive roster? Cool. Pay for the best Pokemon in the game. Love the characters? Nice. Let's pair them with a wedged and rushed storyline. Big Shiny Hunter? Dynamax Adventures have you covered, but in the overworld you won't be able to discern shinies and there will be glitches and exploits to make your time investment completely irrelevant. Bro, there is so much to the idea of the whole double-edged sword thing, pun intended. And to be honest, I think I'd like to introduce a potential caveat here that might be able to bring us a little bit of closure. You see, my friends, Pokemon Sword and Shield had the biggest spotlight of any Pokemon game to date, and we as players and critiques tend to forget that it was the first mainline Pokemon game built for TV. As a franchise, Pokemon went from the best handheld game to something comparable to Breath of the Wild. That's a huge increase in expectations. In a world that Pokemon have literally never really experimented in, outside of slapping your GBA games into Pokemon Stadium, this sort of thing had never really happened before. Allowing fans to experience battles on the big screen is more than just an aesthetic upgrade. The move over to the Switch allowed it to be streamed much easier, and as a result, the community grew exponentially. It brought so many new players to the fold and gave the competitive Pokemon scene a colossal boost, especially after the quality of life improvements made team building easier than ever. That sort of spotlight is impossible to ignore, and it helped Pokemon reach new heights. And the sales of Pokemon Sword and Shield back up my point. In its initial launch, Switch ended up outselling Smash Bros. Ultimate. To this day, it's the number 6 best-selling game on the Switch. Full stop, right behind Mario Odyssey. It can't be that bad if it sold that well, right? For me, this fact undoes a lot of the cons that we've discussed thus far, in that the DLC, despite its flaws, was a great first stab at expanding Pokemon games beyond their launch phase and beyond their hype period. Dynamax Adventures added replayability, and even Dexit became less of a prominent issue as more Pokemon returned through various updates. In hindsight, it feels like Sword and Shield aged like a fine wine. Sure, it may not be as ambitious or big, but what it lacks in size, it makes up for in personality. Dynamax might have felt lazy, but I don't know, man, G-Maxes are cool. The reason these games are so polarizing isn't because they were objectively bad or objectively perfect, is because they were important. They were groundbreaking and deeply flawed at the same time. They had a bigger spotlight on them than any game that had come before, and that spotlight revealed everything. The triumphs and the missteps. Pokemon Sword and Shield didn't just redefine what a mainline Pokemon game could be, it became the new standard bearer for the franchise, and whether you're cheering for the Galar region or shaking your head at it, there's absolutely no denying its impact. These games will be remembered not just as a pivotal moment in Pokemon history, but as a reflection of what it means to take risks in a franchise beloved by millions. Ultimately, Sword and Shield kept me coming back, whether for DAs, the battling thrill, or honestly just being in Galar again. Are they great? Are they terrible? I have absolutely no idea. The floor is open. I want to hear all your opinions. I want to hear your hot takes. I want to hear your ideas on what they could have done differently. No thought is a bad thought. Let's discuss it. Regardless, my friends, I appreciate you so much for watching me ramble about some silly Pokemon stuff. This was fun, and I hope you'll allow me to do it more in the future. So with that being said, I really do hope that I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.